local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Frank Tomaino is our guest. Whenever we have Frank in, we talk about local history. We're going to do that today in general, and in particular, we're going to talk about local theaters, movie houses. It's a subject that I know is of interest to Frank and to me. Before we do any of that, though, we're going to say welcome. Good to see you again.
Yep, great to be here.
Movie theaters, Frank. Theaters in Utica were once, they were everywhere.
Well, going back to the 30s and 40s, there were about 15, 16 movie theaters. I did research one time, and if you combine them all, the seating capacity would be about 14,000. And especially during the Depression and the early part of the early 40s, most of them were filled. It was a major source of entertainment.
Yeah.
Other than you had the radio. Radio was a major source in those days too. But before television, the movies, especially during the Depression, for a dime, 15 cents, you could go in this darkened theater and forget your troubles for a couple of hours. And most of the movies of the 30s reflected this. Very few movies in those days mentioned the Depression. They were feel-good movies, screwball comedies. They liked to poke fun at the rich. And so in Utica at that time, there were about 100,000 people. And I'm guessing that I would say 80,000 went to the movies at least once a week. Many twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week.
Yeah.
So it was very popular. Yeah.
Was the Stanley the biggest? Has the Stanley always been the biggest theater?
Yeah. Well, the seating capacity, close to 3,000, 2,983, I believe. And then some of the other first-run movie theaters downtown, the Avon. The Avon was about 1,200. The Olympic was about 1,000. But yeah, the Stanley was the largest.
You mentioned the Avon. When anybody ever mentions the Avon, I think of that corner. The Avon, the Utica, and the Olympic. What a corner that was, Frank.
Yeah, as you said many times, you could stand in the middle and see the 3 marquees.
Yeah.
And by the late 1930s and 40s, they were movie houses. The Olympic was always a movie house, strictly for movies. But the Avon and the Utica, especially the Avon, was before the Stanley. The Avon was our performing arts center. You had Broadway play. It had a big stage, dressing rooms downstairs. So you had many Broadway plays there. The Utica Symphony Orchestra played there. The Avon. It wasn't as fancy as the Stanley, but it was a major performing arts center.
Now the Olympic was on the south side of Lafayette, at the corner of
Washington. Well, we're not right on the corner.
One door over.
Yeah, Whittig's was on the corner.
Right.
It was across from Hotel Utica. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the Avon and the Utica were around the block from each other.
Right. Yeah. On the Avon was on Lafayette, but on the north side, and Utica was on Washington Street, near Lafayette. Good.
Were those all controlled or owned by the Callett family?
No. The Callett, I think, had the Olympic. I don't think the Callett ever had the Avon. I know it never had the Utica.
Mm-hmm. Independently owned, Frank?
Yeah, I would say so. Mm-hmm. I think the Avon had a working agreement with Warner Brothers, as did the Stanley. Most of your 99% of your Warner Brother movies were at the Stanley or the Avon. The Olympic was 20th Century Fox. And then the other studios, Universal, went anywhere.
And you mentioned first-run movies. Some movie theaters played first-run movies. Other theaters played movies after they'd been out for a while.
Well, we call the neighborhood movie houses. The first run was the Stanley, the Avon, the Olympic, and the Utica. Two theaters that were not quite neighborhood. Was the Oneida and the Uptown. So after movies were shown at the first run, the Stanley and downtown, the real good ones went to the Oneida or the Uptown, and then they went to the neighborhoods, the Rialto, the Family, the Highland, the Lincoln, the old Orpheum, you go on and on, the James.
Right.
People forget that when we went to the movies in the 30s and 40s, we weren't, you saw the movie and that was it. You thought you would never see that movie again, including the Casablancas and all that, because there was no television. We weren't thinking about Turner Classic Movies.
Yeah.
So other than a few movies that the studios would show, like for instance, Gone with the Wind every 7-8 years, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Wizard of Oz. But most of the movies, they were at the first run movie houses, then went to the neighborhood theaters, and then disappeared. You would never see them again, you thought. And then, of course, when television came out, all of a sudden now we see these movies. Thank God, I enjoy them.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
When we come back, I've got to ask you a tough question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Your favorite movie? Maybe you can't do one movie.
We'll
try. Frank Tomaino's our guest. We're talking about movies in general and in particular Utica movie theater. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Frank Tomaino is our guest. We're talking about local movie houses. And Frank has been going to those local movie houses for
100 years, yeah.
for a long time. I asked you before the break, your favorite movie?
Well, I do have a favorite movie. The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, Errol Flynn, Olivia de Havilland, Basil Rathbone. Just a great movie. Not only, and it still holds up today.
Yeah.
It's shown on Turner Classic Movie about once every 3 weeks. Very popular. The plot, the actors, the music blends in with the story. It's just in Technicolor. It's a strange story. I'm sure your viewers have seen The Adventures of Robin Hood. But when Warner Brothers was planning it, they were not thinking of Errol Flynn, who became the perfect Robin Hood. They were thinking of James Cagney, and I just couldn't picture James Cagney, a great actor, playing Robin Hood. Yeah. First of all, he was short. Errol Flynn was tall, but it's just a great movie.
The neighborhood theaters, Frank, one that comes to my mind is the Rialto, and I know you were a good customer at the Rialto.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Well, every section of Utica had a neighborhood theater except North Utica.
Yep.
North Utica never had a neighborhood, and I don't understand why, because even in the 40s, 30s and 40s, the population wasn't that large. But you had Deerfield there, and it wasn't until Riverside Mall came in, where you had the malls had the theaters. But all your other sections, West Utica, South and East, and the East Utica had the Rialto
And
and the family.
you're so right about that, Frank, because if you lived in Cornhill, for example, you weren't that far from the Oneida, you weren't that far from the James or
the Orpheum.
all those, where if you were in North Utica, you had to hike to get to all those.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I can never understand why, because with Deerfield and North Utica combined, you could support a neighborhood theater.
The Rialto, where was that?
That was on Nickel Street in Lansing. It's an empty lot. They tore it down. Great little theater, seated 490, had a balcony, and a typical neighborhood theater. Small stage, but we in East Utica, of course, you had the family too on Bleecker Street, but the Rialto was one of the neighborhood theaters that on Mondays and Tuesdays gave out dinnerware, dishes. So one week you'd get a cup, the next week a saucer, next week a sugar bowl. And if after a year or so you had a nice set, and I understand, I was talking to Fred Capizella, who's a collector, as you know, and he told me a while back that there are still families who have the dinnerware they got at the Rialto, and there were the Highland Theater on Whitesboro, I believe, also gave them out. I'm not sure about some of the others.
And the Highland was across from where the state hospital was, or right down the street a little bit.
Yeah, it was at the foot of Churchill on Whitesboro Street.
That building is still there, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah.
They made it was a gym later on, and then others. I think most of the neighborhood theaters are gone. The Rialto's gone, the family's gone, the Lincoln, the Orpheum.
Where was the Lincoln, Frank?
The Lincoln was one of the I was never at the Lincoln, but I believe it was on Lincoln Ave, but it was just south of Holy Trinity Church in that area there. I believe the Lincoln is the only neighborhood theater I was never in.
Okay.
Yeah, the Rialto I was in most of the time, but the Orpheum, which was on South Street. Years ago there was an Orpheum on Lafayette Street, but the neighborhood theater was on, that's gone. So most of the
Orpheum on South Street was by Miller?
Right at the corner of Miller. Yeah, it was a, in their own way, I gave a talk to the Landmark Society on this not too long ago, and in their own way, these movie houses were landmarks too. You would say, well, where's that in East Utica? Well, it's 2 blocks from the Rialto, or it's near the Uptown, which to me defines a landmark. These movie houses in the 30s and 40s were popular. And until television killed them.
I was reading in your column, in fact, about the James Theater, which was on James near...
It was on the south side of James, between Howard and Nielsen.
Was it on the south side? Yeah.
I'm sorry, the north side.
Yeah.
What am I talking about? The north side.
North side. And it later became like a senior citizen center.
Well, and before that, I believe, a temple, a Jewish temple. And then the Cornhill Senior Center, I believe.
Okay. And the thing that I read in your column that surprised me was the seating capacity of the James.
Yeah, the James was close to 800, which was large for a neighborhood theater. Most of the neighborhood theaters, like the Rialto and the Highland, were about 490, 500. They all had balconies. They all had marquees. It was,
Something that I remember, I don't know about the James, but I remember at the Olympic, of course this was kind of when it was coming to an end, ushers.
The what?
Ushers.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Well, I believe they all did. Even the Rialto, ushers at the Stanley, when they first opened, were in uniform.
And white gloves.
Well, yeah. But the neighborhood theaters, usually it was just one person with a flashlight to help you get a seat.
Yeah.
You know.
Or if you were a little too loud, they'd come down and flick the flashlight
Yeah.
on you. And
You know, sometimes I don't understand. You go to the Rialto, and when we were kids, we would be in the front seat. We'd be looking
Yeah.
up. We were like 3 feet from the screen.
yeah.
Everything was so huge. It's a wonder we didn't get headaches or something.
Yeah. The ushers also made sure. Now today, you go to the movie, and you can buy a soda and take it to your seat. But back then, if you were caught with a soda, you were in trouble.
And since we're talking about the old days,
Yeah.
and during World War II, the ushers in most of the theaters sold war bonds. In other words, after there was usually a double feature. After the first feature, the lights would go on, and the ushers you could buy a war bond. And isn't that something?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, times change.
The movie theaters were economically, back in those days before TV, good business.
It was, yeah. And, you know, in the 30s and the 40s, the prices were so low, you could afford to go. And, families could afford to go to those theaters in the 30s and 40s. The Stanley, when it opened, I think it was 35 cents and 50 cents for the big seats.
Yeah.
But when I first started going to the Rialto, it was 11 cents.
I think I remember paying 25 cents, which got you 2 movies and a cartoon and a newsreel. Not too bad, huh?
Yeah.
Frank Tomaino is our guest. We're talking about local movies. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Frank Tomaino is our guest. I should have said this at the beginning. I assume everybody knows you, but
Yeah.
we should say that Frank continues to write his column for the Observer-Dispatch, a history column that he started back in the 60s, right, Frank?
1968.
Yeah, 68. And he continues to write it. Also, Frank is author of History, just for the fun of it, a book on local history. Drive-in theaters. When did they become popular, Frank?
I think the first was the Calet Drive-In. I don't even know those in Marcy.
Yeah.
The Calet Drive-In was the biggest.
Out by where Whitesboro Central School is now, out that way?
Yeah. I would say I come out of the service in ~55, and it was there, so it had to be probably in the 50s. And then there was another on out on Herkimer.
Schuyler Drive-In.
Schuyler Drive-In, yeah, you forgot the name.
Yeah.
The Calet Drive-In was very, very popular.
Yeah. And then there was the one on Commercial
Oh.
Drive, right?
Yeah, I remember when it would open, it was the WGAT. WGAT was a radio station. Now it's 1310, whatever it is.
WTOB.
WTLB. So it was a WGAT, and then I forget they changed the name, but yes, there was one there.
Yeah.
But the Calet was always the largest and the most popular, I would say. You know.
Yeah. And the most popular, I'm guessing, Frank, movie house in Utica was the Stanley?
The what?
Was the Stanley the most popular?
Oh, I would say so, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Not only because it was a movie house, but because of some of the plays you had there, the Great Artist series.
Mm-hmm.
Roland Chesley started the Great Artist series. You had some very important people, famous entertainers there. Yeah.
And speaking of the Stanley, and I know you know this because you've written about it, the opening show at the Stanley.
Yeah, it was September 10th, 1928. And it was the movie, it was a silent movie, Ramona, with Dolores Del Rio. Anyway, it was a full, the seating capacity was 2,900, but there were 3,500 people there.
Mm.
They were standing, and because there were a couple of they had a couple of, Warner Brothers had started what they called the Vitaphone. So they had a couple of shorts, talkies, but it was a big event. Helen Kelly sang the Star Spangled Banner.
She's a local woman.
Yeah, a local woman, and of course you had the Stanley. Stanley had its own orchestra,
Mm-hmm.
and the ushers were purple and gold uniforms with white gloves. It was a big event, and it drew a lot of the people from the Stanley Corporation there and Warner Brothers. It was a big event, September 28th. Yeah.
As long as we're talking about movie houses, we've got to mention Rome's Capitol Theater.
Oh, well, that opened in 1928 too. The same year that so did the Uptown, all in 1928. The Capitol Theater, I give them a lot of credit now, the movies they show. But yeah, it was their first run movie theater. And we were there when they showed Drums Along the Mohawk.
We gave, and I didn't think we would draw much, to be honest with you.
It was a nice crowd.
But we got a good crowd for that.
Yeah.
What did we spoke before or after I forget.
I think before.
Yeah.
Yeah, about the history of Walter D. Edmonds, the author of Drums Along the Mohawk. But there were over 1,000 people there, I understand. And he took us through, and they were, and this was a few years ago, I understand it's, they really do a good job with.
Yeah, they've renovated that wonderfully.
Yeah, showing the old movies.
Mm-hmm.
I wish the Stanley would do more of that. So showing some of these old movies. Yeah.
Is there a movie, Frank, from days gone by that you don't see anymore, whether it be on Turner Classic Movies or wherever?
What do you mean that are not?
They don't show it anymore.
On Turner Classic?
Yeah, or anywhere else.
Well, I would say Turner Classic. A lot of them, the movie film has just disintegrated.
Yeah.
But I think most of the great movies in the talkies, and even the silent movies, I can't think of any that.
I know one series it was a series of movies that I liked that I don't see much anymore. Maybe it's on, but I don't. Maybe I'm just missing it. Is Mr. Moto? Remember Mr. Moto?
Oh, well, yeah. Peter Lorre. He made
Great
9
actor.
movies, and I've got them all on DVD.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I don't see that on Turner Classic Movie. It could be maybe a contract thing. You're right. I don't see that. Of course, Mr. Moto started in 1938. Very B-series, very popular. There was only one problem. He was a Japanese detective, and when we went to war with Japan, you couldn't have a Japanese detective as a hero, and it disappeared. Although they did make one after the war. But the Sherlock Holmes ones, the Charlie, well, you don't see many Charlie Chans, and it could be now, because of his accent, that offends a lot of people now.
Do you go to the movies anymore, or do you just watch at home?
I haven't gone to the movie in a long time. You
watch at home movies still?
I Turner Classic Movie, but I taped a lot of movies, in the 70s, well, in the 80s and 90s. And in fact, I haven't watched, like a sitcom or a news. I like to watch old movies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you remember your first talkie
Boy, you mean that?
that you saw?
I really don't.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The whole movie industry today, Frank, I mean, it's just...
Well, it's a different,
Yeah.
it's a different ball game. The days, by the 50s when television first come out, that's when movies began, the classic movies that I really enjoyed, the MGM musicals,
Mm-hmm.
the great musicals, Bandwagon, Singing in the Rain. By the mid-50s, you had a different audience. And, the kids growing up were used to watching on television. To us, the movie stars, when I was growing up, were heroes because they were so big on the screen. They were 20 feet tall.
Yeah.
Now, they're on a television screen or they're on your smartphone, they're 2 inches tall.
That plus, if I can interject, that plus the fact that we know so much about their personal lives,
Yeah.
they don't seem to be heroes anymore. Thanks for coming in, I appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. Yep.
I think I'm going to go home and watch The Adventures of Robin Hood. That's going to do it for us this week, but we'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Don't forget CNYhomepage.com. There's lots of good stuff there. Until next time, take care of yourself, everybody.